Welcome to Unwritten, a KP Media news literacy podcast, hosted by the editor-in-chief of the KP Times, Maya Ortiz. This episode of Unwritten is going to cover framing in the media. Framing is the way a news article is set up. Framing decides what story will be told, what will be included, what will be left out. And it's important to note, it doesn't just pertain to written media. Here's an example. Many stories could be written about Super Bowl Sunday. A writer could choose to write about the economic impact of the Super Bowl, they could write about the so-called Taylor Swift effect, or they could write about the closeness of the game, the overtime. All of those are different examples of ways a story could be framed, how a story could be told, what is being told. Let's go with a Travis Kelce approach to a story. If I frame my story around Travis Kelce, it emphasizes his relevance. If I choose to write about him, it tells the reader there's a story to be read, there's a story to be told, there's a story to listen to. That in itself is framing. You chose Travis Kelce as the important part of the Super Bowl game. Then I have to decide what story to share about Kelce. Do I cover his relationship with Taylor Swift, his back-to-back Super Bowl experience, his speech after the game, his action on the field, or his seemingly aggressive interaction with his coach? Picking out of those stories would also be framing. What story about Travis Kelce is important to tell? What do I deem as the writer relevant? Photos also count towards the framing of a story. A picture of Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce leaving an after party elicits a different reaction to a photo of them kissing on the field after a game. Depending on the story I'm telling, would change which photo would best fit. All of that adds to the frame of a story. Framing is basically the choices a journalist makes to tell a specific story. A story will never have all of the details surrounding an event. It would be impossible and probably messy to tell Travis Kelce's whole Super Bowl game timeline in an article, because you have all the prep, you have on the field, all of the games even before the Super Bowl leading up to that point. You have his relationship with Taylor Swift, his family being there. And then you have after the game, his speech and his after party. It'd be a lot. Choosing a specific way to tell a story makes it more cohesive, but it also limits what information a reader will receive. And framing doesn't just apply to written media. Who the camera focuses on during a game is also framing. Photography is an easy one. What makes it in the frame of a photo? What did I crop out? What did I leave in? What did I deem important to be in the center or the focus through rule of thirds? That's all parts of framing. All of these things are, again, conscious decisions made by a journalist before publication. It's choosing what quotes to use. It's who I choose to interview. Who's in my photo? What is my photo of? All of those are conscious decisions a journalist makes to set up their story. It's important to note bias and framing differ. Everyone has a bias. When reading an article, consuming a video, you should take into account the bias of the narrator, the writer, the journalist, those being interviewed. You should definitely take that into account, but it is separate from framing. Framing reflects the choices a journalist makes about how to cover a topic. So what angle am I taking and how am I exploring that angle? Bias would be telling a topic from a perspective that distorts a story to support one thing over another. I hate Taylor Swift, so I'm going to paint her in a negative light. That would be an example of bias. I love Taylor Swift, so I'm going to glorify the impact she has made on the NFL this year. That would be bias. Telling the story of Taylor Swift at a game would be framing, choosing to tell that story. How you tell that story can show bias. So as a journalist, you try your best to be ethical and tell as full of a story as you can. Stay factual, keep it ethical, and try to limit your perspective. As a reader, it's important you acknowledge both framing and bias to acknowledge what you are consuming, to know what it is you're reading, what you are taking away. When consuming media, one should acknowledge how a story is framed to acknowledge what aspect of a story they are consuming. If I'm reading a story about Travis Kelce from the Super Bowl, I should probably acknowledge that there are other players in that game. He might not have been the most significant player that day, but that's what I'm taking out of it. That's what I'm getting out of the article, is his significance during the day. A reader should also acknowledge bias to acknowledge the distortion a certain perspective may add to a story. Depending on who I interview, who I read interviews from, it will change what perspective of the story I'm receiving. Memory, it's faulty. So acknowledging all of that, the ins and outs, what I may be getting that could be forcing me to look at this media from a certain perspective, a reader should take that all into consideration. Bias will be covered in depth in a later episode, but that is all for this episode about framing. Thanks for listening to this episode of Unwritten. Check out K-Park Media on Instagram and Twitter for updates on episodes. Check out kptimes.com for KP Media's publication. Unwritten is hosted and produced by Maya Ortiz.